Hi guys, this is Giovanni Alexander. This is for our INR 4335 course, and I'm doing a review of the Venerable Foe by Donald Snow. Now, Donald Snow is currently a professor, emeritus professor of political science at the University of Alabama. Previously, he served as a visiting professor of political science in the Army War College, Department of National Security and Strategy, and also as a senior research fellow at under the Secretary of the Navy. He also served as a visiting professor of national security affairs at the Air Command and Staff College. Dr. Snow has written over 12 books and 30 articles and book chapters. The Venerable Foe primarily focuses on describing insurgent warfare, which can be traced back as far as over 3,000 years to instructions of warfare and writings by Chinese military strategist Sun Tzu. In Sun Tzu's writings, he describes inferior military forces engaging much stronger foes on the battlefield and engaging in battle. However, not directly, but by utilizing the usual strengths of larger foes and inverting those advantages or using those advantages against them. Many observers would regard this as warfare on the cheap. Now, although insurgent warfare has been utilized throughout human history, Snow writes that it has been mainly misunderstood, and he uses Vietnam as a prime example of how the U.S. military commanders and leaders misjudged the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong combatants in Southeast Asia. There was always a constant debate as to whether to fight a conventional war against insurgent warfare, and uncertainty as to the success of this type of conventional approach to an insurgency. Now, as Snow continued, he states that this uncertainty ultimately hampered U.S. efforts during the Vietnam conflict. And in the decades that followed, Snow elaborates, the insurgency has taken on new namesakes such as low-intensity conflicts. Snow further elaborates that the government, in order to better understand this type of conflict, mandated that the Assistant Secretary of Defense, this was mandated by Congress, was responsible for developing a better understanding of determining countermeasures against this type of warfare. This was mandated in 1986 with the enactment of the Cohen-Nunn Act. According to Snow, this was done due to apprehension by the Pentagon in addressing insurgency. Snow elaborates further that low-intensity conflict was being used to differentiate insurgency conflicts from more high-intensity warfare, such as nuclear war or more conventional war that might be experienced, say, for instance, on the Central European continent. Snow then alludes to the confusion regarding insurgency warfare from a strategic and tactical standpoint, but simplified the main purpose of insurgency warfare is to wear down a superior foe, exhausting them over a period of time. Snow then states that this approach seems to be favored when dealing with foreign foes with superior forces, such as the Americans and French forces in Vietnam. They were worn down over a period of time, and even with superior forces at their disposal. Now, the head of the insurgency during the Vietnam War was General Vo Nguyen Giap. He was the main strategist behind the defeat of the French and American forces in Vietnam during the Cold War conflict. Giap's tactics were compared to the Mongol hordes under Kublai Khan. Also, Japanese tactics that were used in World War II. They were also compared to the Apache chief Cochise. He used tactics that were similar to those in repelling the American cavalry forces during the settlement of the West. Now, Snow further alludes that insurgent tactics are utilized during internal conflicts to overthrow governments, as these techniques were utilized by Mao Zedong to to repel the Japanese during their occupation of China during World War II, and following that to overthrow the nationalist government led by Chiang Kai-shek. Snow then states that because of this insurgency, tactics are typically associated with communism and Marxism. However, Snow rejects this inference and believes that this is unwarranted. Snow would later compare the insurgency to those utilized during the American Revolutionary War. He would reference the Swamp Fox, Francis Marion, or Nathaniel Greene as far as tactics that they used against the British with their superior forces in the Carolinas during the American Revolution. Snow then states that insurgencies have always existed and will continue to be utilized, especially when weak or unpopular governments are viewed as impeding progress. Now, furthermore, Snow then addresses the root or underlying causes of insurgency. He states that societal misery is the main reason or catalyst for an insurgency. He further elaborates that economic conditions, political illegitimacy, and ethnic or intercommunal hatred are secondary reasons for insurgencies to develop. He then references Crane Brinton with his writing of The Anatomy of a Revolution. Brinton mentions revolutionary violence is most likely in emerging societies that have some growth and prosperity, but that the presence of significant groups outside of that prosperity could help to fuel an insurgency. Snowden later elaborates and refers to the understanding where insurgency originates from and refers to traditional insurgency being derived from Clausewitzian perspective or say from political action. Snow then states that not all societies are equally prone to insurgencies. Moving on, he later refers to political deprivation and value expectations and expectancies. The process of how weak societies that lack political legitimacy and continue there are four stages of deprivation and efficacy of political action to change the political situation that can lead to insurgency. He uses the insurgency in Zaire in 1970 to elaborate this point further. Now, the impact of social classes and sourcing the social inequities that can lead to insurgency. The ability to recognize inequity and to change it, as example during the American Revolution, such as improper taxations and the lack of upward mobility, would later fuel insurgencies, future insurgencies, such as in China with Mao Zedong and Fidel Castro during the Cuban Revolution. These leaders would promote resistance not because of any shortcomings that they may have, but due to unjust social order that needed to be overthrown. Snow would later state that Maoist models tended to be the most favored form of insurgency, and because there were three advantages provided to the insurgency. The first is that the government has a monopoly on power, but due to physical or geographic conditions, there were difficulties projecting this power. Secondly, that due to these physical characteristics, that these characteristics would maximize the opportunity, physical characteristics that would maximize the opportunity for the movement to survive. The third advantage is that the insurgency places an emphasis on human resources rather than material resources, on redressing political wrongs. Snow further alludes that terrorism may be successful in the short term, however, positive conversion for a solid base provides a better framework for long-term successes. Fourthly, adherence to the gradual success and patience. This theory is premised by General Roland Giap during the Vietnam conflict. The fifth is that insurgencies are difficult to defeat once they are established. And lastly, the sixth advantage is that successful outside interference from another state outside is difficult. Later, Snow would touch on mobile guerrilla warfare. This is exampled by the Tet Offensive in Vietnam in 1968, and how mobile guerrilla warfare evolved over time, Snow states that the strength of mobile guerrilla warfare gains its strength from an alienated or indifferent populace. He then covers the organizational phase of guerrilla insurgency by framing the three goals of organizing. First, to find a primary safe place where the insurgents can operate from without government interference. Second, is to form material support for the insurgency, such as food, clothing, and shelter. Thirdly, to find sources for armaments and funds, as stated by Mao. Insurgency should be self-sufficient. Snow then discusses a detailed description of the guerrilla phase, which covers organized fighting initiated by the choosing of the insurgency. The guerrilla phase is then followed up by more conventional forces, as utilized by Sun Tzu, Mao, and General Giap during the Vietnam conflict. Sun Tzu and Mao emphasized that the guerrillas only engage in warfare when they have a massive advantage over their foe. Otherwise, the guerrillas will avoid contact. This was the primary tactics utilized by General Giap in Vietnam. Conventional forces, as stated by Snow, would then become critical as the balance turns against the government, as exampled in Vietnam. He then states insurgent warfare was developed by people incapable of defeating modern forces by conventional means. Snow would later elaborate that by stating that insurgencies win by avoiding defeat. To conclude, Snow then states that most Americans fail to empathize or understand insurgency warfare, and this is in part because America is too far removed from its own insurgent past during the Revolutionary War. Furthermore, Americans fail to make the connection to its insurgent past and similarities between the American revolutionists and Maoists. This concludes my interpretation of Snow's reading, The Venerable Foe. I hope it was informative and detailed. Thank you.